more accent in future policies. We see measures obviously in the current plan, and there are agencies that focus specifically on the support to firms like Axio, and then in the current plan, there are more efforts to help build these bridges between the two worlds, the sort of the research world and then the industrial structure of the region. What is also, I think, interesting for example, the new plan that they've developed is that they're trying to have a more territorial approach within Catalonia, so that the regions of knowledge within the region. We have to remember Catalonia is at the scale in terms of surface area, population, and economy of many small European countries. So this is a large area, and there are a lot of different specificities throughout the region, and there's a need, in order to be effective in this knowledge exploitation and knowledge transfer, that a lot of these localized innovation systems work effectively, so that the small firms near the universities can benefit from the knowledge that is generated. So that there are a number of areas in the plan where these, what would be considered relative weaknesses in the system, could be addressed. The increasing recognition that there are a number of skill sets needed for an innovation economy involve not only science, math, but also interdisciplinary approaches to learning. It involves also a desire to learn and mix from science to management, etc. So there are efforts, for example, in the Science and Technology Plan and in other initiatives around OECD countries to start at a young age to train the future workforce and the future innovators and entrepreneurs to think in these more creative, innovative ways. So we can also obviously think about the quality of the education as well as the type of education, and the OECD has the PISA exercise, which helps measure concrete achievements on different scores in math, reading, etc. And there are results for Catalonia. They're not the top within Spain, but it's something that is a sort of warning bell for the future, because these are the future labor market. Another issue which is interesting for Catalonia, which is the massive influx of immigrants. I mean, the population increased by over 1 million in the last decade. So there's not only starting at a young age in terms of the training of the skill set, but also what do you do with your existing workforce in order to help make them contribute to this innovation economy. And that requires a number of other kinds of initiatives in terms of vocational training, lifelong learning, etc. Human capital issues are obviously of a concern. One of the active measures the region has taken is to attract top research talent. And I think in terms of future activities, I know that other, in the plan, in the current plan, there are measures to put in place to try and incorporate into schools and in lifelong learning initiatives more of these principles. But it is definitely a challenge. Yeah.
When you are in a network, if you want to cooperate in order to produce knowledge, you have to have a certain balance, or I'm not saying equality, but a certain balance in terms of access to education, public services. You have to be connected in some sense. And a good level of connection doesn't go very well with huge social disparities, for instance. So you get in these new forms of innovation a much stronger link between, say, efficiency, stricto sensu, defined in economic way, and issues like equity, which before were a bit separated in some sense. Before the idea was, let's go for efficiency, let's go for growth. We know that this process generates inequalities, disparities, and let's generate growth, and that actually with these revenues, take part of these revenues and redistribute. The world of this production of knowledge in a networked way doesn't work in that way. The equity and efficiency are much more intertwined, much more integrated. Now the OECD, precisely, because of these issues and also because of the crisis, there is a sort of a questioning of our growth model, our development model. And now the OECD, is evolving the debate towards what people call a new development model, which in some sense is a much better integration between three angles of societal progress, which are efficiency, growth, economic activity, market, the equity, social dimensions, fairness dimensions, and environmental sustainability. It's like the three E's, equity, efficiency, and environment. We need a model which is much more integrated in these three dimensions. And for instance, the agenda that now is pretty much in the top priorities of the OECD, which is the green growth agenda, is precisely about generating green with growth and growth with green, right? Because we know if we have growth and that generates a lot of bad things in terms of environment, our model is not sustainable. But we also know, and especially because of the crisis, that we focus a lot on environment, on reducing, on cutting emissions, without generating jobs and growth. The whole thing will not going to work either. So we need both at the same time. And this is a big challenge, and innovation, it will be key in this sort of a green growth strategy. Some countries in the OECD are sort of in a very active way taking this new model. For instance, a country like Korea, they decided that green growth is a national priority. So they see this not only as a way of having a society which is more sustainable with a higher quality of life, but also a way of generating a lot of sort of innovations, new products, new services that also are going to generate growth. So Korea is actually one of the most sort of countries among the OECD engaged in this new green growth model. But for instance, in the US, this agenda, a lot of the stimulus package of the economy decided in the aftermath of the crisis actually is related with the development of this new green economy.
You have some regions that are strong in developing technologies and innovations that are relevant for green growth. They have policies in place to help ensure that the movement of people, the construction of buildings, that all of those are in line with the idea that we need to reduce our carbon footprint, we need to recycle waste, we need to preserve water, and those kinds of measures that are taken often at subnational level as opposed to national level, given the distribution of competencies, leaves a very important role for regions and cities in this area. So you have examples in Japan of eco-industrial parks where the recycling and waste is used to drive the park. You have a myriad of different ways of addressing this issue, and we'll be looking at regions that are strong in the development of the technologies, regions that are strong in applying it, regions that are strong in helping create a culture among their citizens regarding green growth, and so it's very important for the OECD.
I think this point is very important. Is that indeed that at the regional level, at the city level, these links appear in a much more sort of a complementary or stronger way than if you see these things at the aggregate level. At the aggregate level, basically, if you want to have both green and growth, it's sort of complicated. Green is always sort of a constraint to growth. You have to give up a little bit of growth if you want to have green. But you look at these issues, these connections, at the level of cities or even rural regions, the complementarities, the synergies appear in a much sort of stronger way. For instance, in cities, it's obvious that if you want to have greener cities, you have to make cities a bit more compact. We have to have buildings because more compact cities mean less transportation flows. You have to have buildings that much more efficient from the energy use point of view, and actually, generating all these new products and services for cities is going to be good for environment, and is going to be good for the environmental quality of the city. And actually, the environmental quality, we have studies on that show that actually the environmental quality is something that increases the economic attractiveness of the city. So again, a very strong sort of synergy. Take, for instance, the example also of rural areas. In rural areas, that are evolving away from sort of typical traditional agricultural sorts of production, the production of renewable energy is going to be located in rural areas. Where you have space to put windmills, to put solar plants, to produce biofuels in rural regions. So you could have there a very strong connection again between something that develops, generates growth for these rural regions, and and the sort of a better environment, or the production of a form of energy which is good for the environment as a sort of a lower